Thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is Patrick Halley. I'm the Executive Director of the Next Generation 911 Institute. And thank you for coming to our event today, When Disaster Strikes, the Critical Role of 911 During Major Disasters. So I'm very delighted to be here with 911 leaders from the Virgin Islands, as well as the Miami-Dade area in Florida. And we will also have a speaker from Greater Harris County, Houston, who is en route after having gotten off his plane with some de-icing. So just a quick word on the NG911 Institute. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is simple. It's to assist the Congressional Next Generation 911 Caucus by providing an educational resource for members of Congress and their staff and other policymakers in Washington. Our objective is fairly simple. It's to raise awareness about 911, and in particular the need to modernize our 911 system to a next generation 911 capability. We've been around since 2003, which is also when the 911 Caucus, it was originally the Enhanced 911 or E911 Caucus, was formed. It's now the Next Generation 911 Caucus, led by Representatives Shimkus and Eshoo in the House and Senators Klobuchar and Burr in the Senate. It's the only caucus focused exclusively on 911 emergency communications issues. Have over 80 members now, and if your boss is not a member, I encourage them to do so. And if you have any questions about that process, please let me know. Of course, this event and all the events that the NG911 Institute organizes is only possible because of the generous support of our sponsors. So I do want to recognize those sponsors, many of whom are in the room today, and thank you for your continued support of our effort. So what we're going to talk about today is the impact that the storms last summer in August and September had on the communities in the Virgin Islands, as well as Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas. So I want to just give a little snippet of some of the facts around that to sort of key up the discussion before I introduce our keynote presenter, Chairman Pai from the FCC. So I'm sure you all saw the stories just like I did of the damage that was done to these communities by multiple hurricanes. And just to give you a little sense, starting with Hurricane Harvey, which hit in late August on the Gulf Coast in Texas. The FCC, and I should say to the FCC staff in the room, there are also multiple people from the FCC who produced consistently every single day as these storms were occurring, really valuable information on the status of communications network in areas where the hurricanes had affected. So just as an example, on August 27th in Texas, we had 17 911 centers that were affected by the hurricane. You had one that was completely down with no ability to reroute calls. You had one that was up but wasn't getting any location information. You had several that were able to reroute calls, but only to do it without location information. And then you had several that were rerouting calls with location information. So you had a lot of varying impacts on the ability of the 911 centers in those areas to handle calls as they came in. And this is right when the storm hit, probably slightly before the actual flooding went in that you all saw on TV in the Houston area. In terms of the networks, you could see that in some parts of Texas, you had between 80 and 95% of cell sites out of service. Those were relatively quickly restored in Texas, is my understanding, but you did have large areas of that part of the state that had no cell coverage at all, with the towers being out of service. Hurricane Irma, of course, came next. This affected my friends in Florida quite extensively. They were generous enough to provide these images, which, as you can see, the winds were just extremely extensive, a lot of damage, a lot of flooding, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Similarly, shortly after that was Hurricane Maria. These images were provided by my friends from the Virgin Islands here, and as you can see, the damage in the Virgin Islands as well as Puerto Rico was quite extensive. To give you a sense of that, in Puerto Rico, we had the main PSAP stands for Public Safety Answering Point, for those of you who don't do this stuff every day. The main 911 center was offline, and calls were being sent to a backup 911 center. And then in the Virgin Islands, we had the St. Croix Center was completely down with significant damage, and the St. Thomas Center was unable to receive location information for wireless calls or for voice over IP 911 calls. And in terms of damage to the wireless infrastructure, it was very extensive in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands. This is just a snapshot, but at the beginning of the hurricane, about 90% of cell sites were out of service in Puerto Rico. Some areas had 100% of the cell sites out. And in the Virgin Islands, we had 70% of cell sites out of service, 100% out in St. John. And there were, due to the power outages, you also had large percentage of consumers who didn't have any wireline service available to them. So it was a massive amount of destruction that these hurricanes caused. And our 911 centers had challenges, but they also performed admirably. And I look forward to having a conversation with the folks who made that possible today. But before we do that, it's my pleasure to introduce FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. Ajit Pai is chairman of the FCC. He was designated by President Trump in January of 2017. He had previously served at the FCC, appointed by then President Barack Obama, and confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate in May 2012. Prior to becoming an FCC commissioner, Chairman Pai was, among other things, a law firm partner. He served in the FCC's Office of the General Counsel, worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and in the Department of Justice. He grew up in rural Parsons, Kansas, which is probably why one of his probably the top priority is to close the digital divide by bringing the opportunities of broadband connectivity to all Americans. Public safety is also a top priority. He's taken action to ensure that consumers can reach emergency services whenever they dial 911, including from multi-line telephone systems, which became a top issue for the chairman when he was a commissioner, and has led in large part thanks to his efforts and others to Congress taking up the issue by the passage of Kerry's Law in the House and Senate. He's called on the FCC to help law enforcement combat the rising threat of contraband cell phones in jails and prisons. He's pushing for improvements in the ability of consumers to receive timely and geographically relevant wireless emergency alerts. Not sure if you've heard anything about the emergency alerting system recently. And he's pushed for the advancement of next generation 911. For me, what's important is that the chairman has always made it a point to visit 911 centers and hear firsthand from 911 professionals about the work they do, including the areas affected by hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria that we'll discuss today. And I've actually had the pleasure of visiting a couple 911 centers in rural Illinois and suburban Indianapolis with the chairman as well. And at each of those stops, Chairman Pai has shown great interest and understanding of how the system works, the challenges with the existing system, and has always been interested in how the FCC can help. Finally, perhaps most importantly, he's a long-suffering Kansas City Chiefs fan. And I'm told by his staff he's a decent rapper and a binge Netflix watcher. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Chairman Pai.
Well, thank you, I think, Patrick, for that introduction. And thanks as well to the NG 911 Institute for holding this event and for inviting me to participate. Thank you to the Executive Director of the Institute, Patrick Halley, for your advocacy and, more importantly, for your friendship over these many years. And most importantly, thank you to the first responders who are here today, in particular, the panelists who are arrayed before you. I had a chance to meet Nadia and Carolyn, and I got to meet Greg a few months ago, and Ronald. It's one thing, I think, to talk about these issues. It's another thing for people from the Virgin Islands and Florida to come to Washington in January to talk about these issues. So there should be no question whatsoever about their dedication. We talk a lot here in Washington about improving 911 systems, but ultimately, 911 depends on the emergency responders doing the job, and that is exactly what they do. These are hardworking public servants who field calls, they dispatch assistance, and eventually put out fires, sometimes literally. Your sacrifice and your dedication are inspirations to us all, and I've seen that for myself in the places you work. The Institute's focus on the critical role of 911 during major emergencies couldn't be more timely. Last year, as Patrick mentioned, we saw the most devastating Atlantic hurricane season in recent memory, which included an unprecedented 4 major hurricanes making landfall in the United States. 2018 hasn't exactly been quiet either. We've already witnessed deadly wildfires and mudslides in California, and as I'm sure you know, a false missile alert in Hawaii this past Saturday. And to be sure, this false alert isn't specifically a 911 issue, but it did drive home in a dramatic way, I think, how critical it is for emergency communication systems to operate correctly. Now, the false alert in Hawaii may not have resulted in serious physical injuries or deaths, but we shouldn't minimize the panic that was felt by many Americans who, for up to 38 minutes, believed that they might only have minutes to live. Many placed calls to loved ones to say goodbye, and you may have seen the video of a parent trying to put a child in a storm drain. It must have been searing for parents to experience that kind of fear with their children. And what do you tell them about what's going on in a situation like that? Well, the false alert sent in Hawaii was completely unacceptable and avoidable. And the FCC has already launched an investigation. We want to find out exactly what happened and how to make sure that it never happens again. Based on the information we've collected so far, it appears that the incident was caused both by human error and by the state of Hawaii not having reasonable safeguards in place to prevent that human error from leading to the transmission of a false alert. And this leads to a lesson that is critical for emergency communication systems of all kinds, including 911. They shouldn't be designed so that a single point of failure leads to a catastrophic result. Nothing and no one is perfect. Our emergency communication systems need to be designed to take account of these realities by having appropriate safeguards and redundancies. And this afternoon, we'll hear firsthand from some of the heroes who helped lead the response to last year's hurricanes and saved lives in Florida and in Texas and in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I should note that one of those heroes, Stan Heffernan of Greater Harris County 911, who isn't here yet, hosted me when I visited Texas in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. And I was inspired personally by what he showed me. For example, the homes of many of the 911 call center's employees were flooded, but these dedicated public servants didn't let that stop them from getting the job done. Some of them both worked and slept at the call center for days on end in order to help their fellow Houstonians. And think about what that shows to residents of that community and to the country. Now, two of our panelists are from Miami-Dade County, and following Hurricane Irma, I visited the Miami-Dade County Emergency Operations Center with my colleague, Commissioner Clyburn. I tried out my high school Spanish, as you might recall, at the time as well. Thank you. Gracias por todo. Sí. It was impressive hearing and seeing how everyone, from emergency management personnel to a radio broadcaster who was visiting from Key West, stepped up to serve South Florida in a time of need. It really was an all-hands-on-deck situation, and all hands did indeed show up on deck. And I came away from my visits to Texas and Florida, as well as a subsequent trip to Puerto Rico, in awe of the work that is done by first responders. Emergency response is a life and death job. The highest stakes demand the highest standards, and the professionals I met in Houston and in Miami and in San Juan certainly met those standards. Now, of course, we also need emergency communication systems that meet those high standards. The American public and our first responders deserve nothing less. And that's why I'd like to outline briefly two areas. Welcome. We weren't taking attendance, so you're safe. I'd like to outline briefly just two areas in which the FCC wants to work with the NG 911 Institute and other stakeholders in the public safety community. The first one involves best practices. We need to learn from our experiences over the last several months and develop best practices so that we're better prepared and more effective in responding to future disasters. We may not know when those disasters are going to happen, but we do know they are going to come. Now, in December, our Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC issued a public notice seeking input on the public and private sector's preparation for and response to the 2017 hurricane season. We want to know what worked and where we can improve service availability and restoration. And we want to hear from all stakeholders, including the public safety community, state and local and territorial and tribal officials, from industry, from consumer groups, and from federal response partners. And 911 needs to be at the core of this conversation. We've seen that when major disasters take place, they put tremendous strain on the 911 system and make it harder for incoming calls to get through. When I visited Stan, for instance, in Houston, he and others told me that at Harvey's peak, they received more than 3,100 calls to 911 each hour, which is 10 times the normal call volume that they get. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, the public safety answering point, as Patrick mentioned, that served St. Croix was knocked out of service by Hurricane Maria. And of course, in many areas where PSAPs were able to receive calls, power outages cut off residents' access to telephone service, and with it, their ability to access 911. This was a big problem in Puerto Rico, as I saw for myself. So going forward, we need to harness the expertise from the private sector and all levels of government to improve the resiliency of the 911 system and address surges in call volume. Now, the second area in which we want to work closely with you is in accelerating the transition of America's PSAPs, public safety answering points, to next generation 911. Moving to NG 911 is important for a whole host of reasons. Now, one that's sometimes overlooked is that NG 911 networks can support greater resiliency and redundancy and reliability than legacy 911 networks. To cite just one example, by linking PSAPs to a state or regional emergency services IP network, or ESINet, NG 911 can enable 911 calls to be rerouted when a local PSAP loses power or gets a surge of 911 calls that they aren't able to handle. And I saw firsthand the strength of this approach during a very informative public safety visit to Harrisburg, Illinois, which was hosted by the co-chair of the Congressional NG 911 Caucus, Congressman John Shimkus. A little over a dozen counties, mostly rural, came together in southern Illinois, and they set up a unified public safety communication system with two major hubs. They created a robust NG 911 capable network that leverages the advantages of scale to make it more economical and ensures that rural Illinoisans are protected wherever they happen to be. We also need to think about how to integrate NG 911 with other key elements of the emergency communications ecosystem, including FirstNet and emergency alerts and warnings. Last fall, I visited 911 centers in Noblesville, Indiana, and Wichita, Kansas, and I was impressed by the work that those communities are doing to think through some of these issues. So, developing best practices and accelerating the NG 911 transition, these are just two of the many challenges in front of us. There's clearly a lot of work to do, as I'm sure you know, but who better learn from than from some of the public safety officials who were literally in the eye of the storm during the hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Maria. Thanks again to them and to all the first responders who heroically stepped into the breach to help their fellow Americans when it counted. Now, helping them, these folks, achieve their mission is in the FCC's DNA. Section 1 of the Communications Act charges the Commission with promoting the safety of life and property through the use of wire and radio communications. And we are committed, I'm personally committed to meeting that challenge by working with the public safety community to give you the tools that you need in order to keep people safe going forward. Thanks again to the NG 911 Institute for hosting me, and I look forward to a very interesting and informative discussion. And thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chairman Pai. So now what we're going to do is turn to a moderated discussion. We like to keep it as conversational as possible, so while I will guide the conversation, to the extent that anyone has questions that they want to add to the discussion, please raise your hand and we'll make sure to include you in the conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel who, as Chairman Pai mentioned, was front and center helping the citizens of the Virgin Islands and Florida and Texas during these hurricanes. So to my left is Nadia Fearon, from the 911 District Manager from St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, as well as Carolyn Watley, who's the 911 District Manager for the Virgin Islands Territorial Emergency Management Agency. And to my right, Stan, welcome, glad you could make it. Stan Heffernan, who's the Chief Operations Officer for Greater Harris County 911 in Texas, along with Greg Rubin, Communications Chief for Miami-Dade Fire Rescue, and Police Lieutenant Ron Sliman from the Miami-Dade Police Department. And Stan, since Harvey hit first, we'll start with you. But I'd like to have each of you just talk a little bit about your 911 center in terms of where you serve, annual call volume, whether or not you handle communications for police, fire, and EMS, sort of what kind of center you are, where you are, talk about your operations, and then provide just a sort of a high-level summary of the overall impact of the hurricane on your operations, and then we'll get into some of the details after that. So why don't we start with Stan?
So my name is Stan Heffernan. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Greater Harris County 911 Network, and we basically provide service for Harris and Fort Bend counties in the state of Texas. Our annual call volume is roughly 4 million. We do serve 34 call centers, and we provide the infrastructure and systems to deliver those calls. So that's our expertise. We don't answer the calls, but we provide all the technology and the systems to do so. So again, for us, Harvey was really not a large wind event. It was, as you all know, an unprecedented flooding event. So we're very used to flooding in Houston. I've been through quite a few myself through some contingencies, but as you may see on some of the slides, this was definitely unprecedented. So we were prepared, but I would challenge anyone that's involved to prepare and then think again, because this storm did some things that we had never seen before. And we had been through Allison. Some of y'all might have heard of Allison. So. But again, for us, our system stayed fairly operational, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We have almost fully transitioned to NG911, and it was a huge benefit for our contingencies, for our redundancy, and to be flexible, to be able to move PSAPs around, allow those call centers to log in at different locations and take calls. That's kind of a big overview.
Great. Then we had Irma, of course, so maybe Greg and Ron, if you could talk a little bit about your centers and that hurricane.
With that, go ahead, Ron. Would you start?
Good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Ron Sliman with Miami-Dade Police, and my responsibilities are at the 911 Center, the primary PSAP for Miami-Dade County, and I'm in charge of technological support. I've been there for almost 13 years now in that capacity. We pride ourselves on preparing for large events, whether it be natural, man-made, protests, some of the Americas. So we're used to doing Super Bowls. We have a lot of Super Bowls. So we're used to doing very large-scale events with a lot of people, and big demands on not only our 911 system, but also LMR. That's the radio systems that police and fire use. One of the things is you prepare, but you think you're prepared, you better think of option A and option B, because a lot of times you're going to have to go to option B. You have generators, and then you need to have backups to those generators, because generators, when they're run for a long period of time, tend to fail, even if they're brand new generators. They only can run so long or have a hiccup. So there's a lot of things we can talk about later as we get further into the discussion, but it's important for the technology, but I also want to focus on the people, okay, behind the technology. Your technical staff and the actual people that are actually answering the calls to the public and the toll that the storms take on them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Go ahead, Andy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Rubin. I'm the Communications Chief for Miami-Dade Fire. First of all, with our dispatch centers and our PSAP, the way we work together in Miami-Dade County, our folks work 3 different and very trained and very unique disciplines the way we operate. We have 911 call takers, and that's all they do is take 911 calls, and then we have police dispatchers, and that's their responsibility. They don't answer 911 calls, and then we have fire rescue dispatchers who dispatch fire and fire vehicles, hazmat, and that type of stuff, and EMS, and that's what their responsibilities are. So together, we, Miami-Dade County, both police and fire, handle all communications for the county itself within our territories, and so that's kind of our responsibility. Just to lead on to what Ron said is that, and that's important, is to not only understand that you have to have the backups to the technology, but you also have to have the considerations of the people and those that are going to be there working and doing the job every day. Ron and I were probably, I know that at one point we were about 5 days straight, and we never left and went home and that type of stuff. So it was quite a challenge for not only those that the men and women on the fire trucks and the police officers out there responding, but for also the 911 call takers and the telecommunicators, the dispatchers. Their responsibilities were very challenging at the same time.
Thanks, Greg. Carolyn, you want to talk about the Virgin Islands?
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Watley. I am the 911 District Manager in St. Thomas, St. John, and Water Island. I manage a very unique operation. It's housed in St. Thomas. We have about 12 stations. It's one PSAP, 12 stations, and our operators are trained to be call takers, fire, EMS, and police dispatchers. So on any given day, they do all those disciplines, unlike a lot of other PSAPs where they have specific assignments. The operators do it all. We service about, I would say, 15 to 20,000 calls a month. During the hurricanes, the calls went sky high. We were topping about 5,000 calls for that one evening. And lucky for us, our call center did not go down. So we were able to take all calls. Of course, we couldn't respond as we would like. But we were able to take all calls and hopefully help someone during that time. We also were unique, the St. Thomas and St. John Islands. We were also unique because we got impacted by both Irma and Maria. And so it was very, very difficult. Like was mentioned earlier, we were prepared to stay 16 hours, maybe 24, maybe 48. We ended up staying almost a month. Myself, operators, and of course operations. In Vitima, we ended up staying in the center and in the building for about a month. And so it was unique in that sense. Our generators, very important, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we have 2 generators on site. We figured, well, we have a backup to the backup. No. Both the generators at one point went down, and we were out of operations after Maria for about, I would say, a couple hours, which impacted the islands greatly. So we'll discuss that a little bit further in detail.
Good afternoon. My name is Nadia Fearon. I'm the district manager for the 911 PSAP St. Croix district. Similar to Ms. Watley, I have 12 workstations. The employees, same way, trained as operators. Unlike other PSAPs, our operators, they don't just take calls. So anyone who's the EMS dispatcher or your fire dispatcher, they take calls and dispatch simultaneously. And that might be for any call. Our population on St. Croix is about 51,000. Of course, we definitely, after Maria, well, during the storm, one of the major T1 lines that connects all the phone calls coming into my center, that was damaged. So we were unable to get any calls. We were down for about 40 hours total. In addition to the T1 line being damaged, a lot of the cell sites is where the radio backup or how the radios communications is housed. Those sites were severely damaged and inaccessible. And the backups to those cell sites were also damaged. So like everyone else said, we have a lot to discuss here about, planning and other options, especially for the islands. I guess we kind of have to be considered just like any rural area in United States, unfortunately. But yeah, we definitely have to talk about communication and getting calls and making sure calls are able to get into the center, text, anything, by any means.
Great. So what you guys highlighted in all those answers was there's basically three broad components to this, right? One is, can the citizens access 911, right? So are the networks in which they are going to communicate and seek assistance, whether it be wireline or wireless, up and running? Or are they damaged? And if so, how do they get help? That's one point. Two is the 911 center itself, right? Is the 911 center up? Does it have power? Is it able to receive calls? If it is able to receive calls, is it getting all the information that normally come with a 911 center, or is there any degradation in the service? And then third is the ability of the responders in the field to be have emergencies dispatched to them, and also to communicate among themselves using the radio systems that they have. So there's a lot of different links in the chain that have to all be working for the system to function as we expect it to. And all of those took a hit during these emergencies. So I'll throw it out to whoever wants to start. We can start with the Virgin Islands, do it that way this time. Talk about the impact of the infrastructure itself that enabled citizens to communicate, and to the extent that they weren't, how did they get help if they couldn't reach you?
After Maria, both centers were still up. So after Maria, we didn't have much impact to the cell towers at that time. So people were still able to text. We got a lot of Facebook messages. Unfortunately, our communications between each other were already affected at that time. Basically, we're set up to be each other's backup. So if my center goes down, Watley's center is supposed to be my backup, and vice versa. However, I guess our telephone company in the Virgin Islands is now called Via. So unfortunately, it appears that they took a severe hit from Irma. So that already affected the way we dispatch or took calls, because now we couldn't be each other backup. We couldn't communicate with each other. Actually, I think a couple of days after Irma, we only were able to communicate from Wi-Fi in WhatsApp. And that's how we were checking on our employees and communicating back and forth between us. After Maria, the system went completely down for me. So there goes Wi-Fi, there goes telephone lines. And even if households were able to have landlines, once the electricity is out in the Virgin Islands now, landlines are affected. So once the little backup battery on the pack that they give you from the telephone company, that goes out, you don't have a landline in your house anymore. So imagine not being able to call via cell phone, not having a landline to call. You're just hoping that you could get somebody down the street to a police station, a fire station, any station to ask for help.
And in addition to what Fearon said, what we did on St. Thomas and St. John was we strategically placed our rescue units in different places on about the island. And so with the radio communication, after our telephone lines stayed up, but they were so busy, some of the callers, you couldn't understand what they were saying because they're talking above a hurricane. Their roof is gone. We couldn't understand them. So with the rescue members placed strategically about the island, we were able to get eyes, outside, even though they were indoors. They would notify us on the radio. Well, we're in Bordeaux, which is the west end of the island, and I see about 3 roofs that are going. We're in the middle of the island. We see the water is coming up on the waterfront. We see plants breaking. And so it gave us a better sense of peace that we knew what was happening. Unlike Fearon, we continued to have phone service throughout the hurricane. I think it may have gone down as far as texting for some strange reason for a couple hours, but the calls kept coming. We also used Wi-Fi, Facebook. I mean, we used Facebook. Facebook really came in handy the night of the storms because people were posting, listen, I have my mother is at this address. You know, she's locked. She texted last call. Her roof was going. Can somebody check? And so with that, and of course the WhatsApp and also all other social media aspects, we're able to have rescue go out when the storm passed to a certain degree and start looking for people, which was good because if we waited any longer, we would have had a higher death toll.
Yeah.
So social media really came in handy during that time.
And I do want to talk about social media specifically in a bit, but in terms of the impact on the communications capabilities in Florida and Texas, Greg.
Okay. So for us, Irma was a slow-moving storm. We began to get into storm conditions on a Saturday night, wasn't it? Saturday night, and it ended about Sunday morning. Monday morning, late Sunday night, early Monday morning. And one of the things you have to remember is that during this time, and I know we're going to discuss about people a little bit later, but so your staff, our communications staff, has been preparing their own families and everything else, and the dispatch, the communication centers, and now the storm is here. So it's a very slow-moving storm. On Monday morning, greater than 90% of Miami-Dade County was without electricity. And that may sound like not that big of a deal initially to some folks, but realize that the wireless networks are designed for short blips of outages. Typically, their UPSs or their uninterruptible power supplies are designed to last minutes to a few hours just to maintain the system up during short outages. So we had a substantial amount of wireless towers out from all the carriers throughout the county. As was just mentioned too, a lot of folks have transitioned from traditional wireline telephones to VoIP now. So they're using the cable company or something like that, and none of those systems have the robust capacity to withstand power outages either. So most folks now are completely cut off from the traditional means that they would reach out for emergency services. The generators also, and we'll talk about, I know we're going to talk about some redundancy later, but one of the things that happens during a storm, at least during hurricanes like this, is there's a pressure drop. And that pressure drop can cause some generators to turn off. What happens is they don't turn back on again. They don't automatically flip on. The generators, when they lose power initially from the power company, they'll come on automatically, but in mid-cycle, if they turn off, they won't turn back on again. That's something that we've experienced during storms, and we just know it's going to happen. Preparation. So we're fortunate enough that we have 2 dispatch centers. We run primary dispatch center all the time, but we have a backup center, each of us do, that are ready to go. Not staffed, but all the computers, all the equipment, all the technology, everything is there. Our folks at any time, all they need to do is walk in the door and it's operational. And it can hold full capacity of our backup center can do the same. During the storm, we staffed both centers. And we utilized both centers at the same time. We would offload some non-essential work to the backup center, and vice versa. We would flex back and forth, giving our folks some relief at the same time. So making those type of plans and exercising them and then bringing them to reality during a storm are all critical.
Dan, in terms of Houston, obviously the flooding was what got the most attention, but did the flooding have an impact on ability for people to communicate? And I guess for all of you, talk about the surge of calls that you got. You guys already mentioned the amount you got, but the surge.
Yes, so for us, there were a few central office failures on the wireline side, but we all know the majority of calls are wireless now. So we had
Percent, just out of curiosity.
85% of our calls now are wireless. Yeah. So that being said, on the wireless side, at one point there were 169 cell sites down, but in our area that's out of 3,000. So I do think the carriers did a pretty darn good job getting those sites back up with mobile assets. We did notice though that they were doing their contingencies, and those kind of mess us up on our end because a lot of times they'll route those to a third-party call center, and then that third-party call center will then transfer into our sites over 10-digit, and we all know what happens then. So most of the time we don't get location information, and we're busy answering 911. So those are some of the things that, you know, we would like to see in a next-gen environment to work with the providers to interface their contingencies directly with our systems. So as far as our systems, again, they were healthy. We were able to leverage our data centers and our next-gen equipment. We were even able to stand up a PSAP in a full wireless LTE environment for one of the sites that was evacuating due to the rising waters. So we have a lot of those assets available to us, so that was a good thing.
So let's talk about call volume. So on a given day, our PSAP, which is a primary PSAP, there's a total of 8 in Miami-Dade County. Primary being Miami-Dade County itself, and probably the smallest being a PSAP that has 2 positions, and then you also have Homestead Air Force Base, which has their own PSAP now. But the responsibility of Miami-Dade County is having the ability to take all the calls for Miami-Dade County. In addition to that, with this storm, we were tasked with taking calls from Monroe County also, because they had no services. They had no phones, they had no radios. We had to give their officers radios because they couldn't get to their depot to get new batteries. So we had to give them loaner radios, loaner batteries, and loaner equipment until they could get back up and running. Their radio system was down, their LMR was down. When people evacuate, the way we're set up from the Keys, from Monroe County, they come to Miami-Dade County. We have shelters pre-designated for them. So imagine the entire population of the Keys evacuating to another county. Imagine the influx of 911 calls, especially after the storm, when they're calling us to try to find out what happened because they have family members they can't get in contact with. And I can tell you that, you know, the way the system's set up now, phase 1 and phase 2, when a 911 call comes in, we get the provider, right, the cell provider, when it comes in via cellular. We get the phone number. We don't get subscriber information. And in addition to that, we do get a location, okay? But what we're getting is we're getting the tower. We are not getting the actual location, okay? We have to send a signal back out to get phase 2 information. And it's called rebidding. And what we do is, what we noticed in the storm was because of all the cell phone towers down, you weren't getting phase 2 information on a lot of calls. And if you were, you had to rebid. And I know the cell providers were taxed because, you know, all the call centers were doing that. So we looked at the call volume, and we, at certain hours, doubled and tripled the call volume. And that was pre-storm and then post-storm. And it was very difficult, I think, from the 911 perspective. You know, knowing where somebody's at and where to send the help is extremely important. And, you know, it's very hard to tell the public, and this is the importance of NextGen 911. It's very hard when they ask you, hey, how come I can order a pizza from my phone and they know exactly where I'm at, but I can't tell you exactly where I'm at right away, calling 911. And that's very hard for the public to understand. And those are a lot of questions we get asked on the local level.
Let me just add to something there. One of the challenges you also have to keep in mind is when you're in an operational environment. So it's not just all about technology, it's also the people that are using the technology. At a certain point during an event like this, we go to a no response situation because it's too dangerous for the first responders, for the police officers and the firefighters to actually go out on the road and be out on the road. And it's painful for our folks knowing when a call's coming in and someone's having a life-threatening emergency that there's really nothing and that we're powerless to be able to do anything about it. And then the communications is challenged to maintain communications with them to try and get status updates. So you've got challenges with the technology, finding locations where people are, and you've got challenges even in a response capacity, and then maintaining that infrastructure at the same time during and then post-storm.
So in addition to the location challenges, you know, maybe some of the calls when they did come through didn't have a location. I know that was a challenge for you guys. were calls backed up in queue, essentially, were people forced to hold? And one question just for all of us is, if that does happen, what is your advice to the caller? Is it to just hang in there and stay on hold, or what should they do or not do?
I can't speak to how every fire department handles their response, but Miami-Dade Fire Rescue has a policy of we respond to every call. We don't queue any of our calls. So every time a call comes in, we dispatch a unit, period. We don't queue calls. We don't make people wait or hold. So at the end of, was it Monday morning or Monday night Sunday night or Monday morning, we had hundreds of calls holding. When we went into a no response capacity, we had some of our folks, our paramedic officers, sitting in our dispatch center, and they would continuously call folks back to check on them, to give them information, to try and give them assistance and that type of thing. Remember, the 911 call taker traditionally uses a script to triage, get certain amount of information to determine what type of resource is needed to respond. They don't have the type of training that, although it's pre-arrival instructions, not for hours. It's pre-arrival instructions to handle when they dialed 911 and got the information to when the first responders arrive. So we set up a team of folks in our dispatch center of officers, of lieutenants, paramedics, so they would continuously call folks throughout the evening and throughout the storm and update them with our status, and we would then get updated with their status.
From the 911 perspective, we generally answer calls in 911 calls in about 1.3 seconds around the clock. Once you get to the height of the storm, it's really hard to keep that level. You know, the state standards and the 911 plan is out the door because you're just inundated. But as far as calls holding, I think the longest they held, maybe 30, 40 seconds on average. Obviously, at some points there were, you get an inundation of calls at one point, especially with cellular, because you have an event that happens and everybody in that one area has a cell phone. So you could be going from your normal average to the board's lit up and you got a whole bunch holding, and then you have to triage everyone. We've got it, and you have to talk to every one of those. And we had an increase also of callbacks. We had to do a lot of callbacks because people did hang up and then they called again, or we lost them because cell sites were down. So they had enough, coverage to get to that cell site, and then they lost it, and then capacity on the cell sites that were picking up the traffic from the other surrounding cell sites that were down. So, and as far as the police goes, there was a point during the storm where there was probably about 400 or 500 calls for service holding because we could not dispatch the officers. Miami-Dade County is so large that, once we get to a certain sustained wind speed, we tell them not to go out. But depending upon where the storm's hitting and where the squall lines are going out, that's also left up to the lieutenants on the road, the platoon commanders, because on the south end of the county, it might be really bad. But for that, half-hour time period, you get a lull on the north end of the county. So it's a give and take, and a lot of the discretion is left with the commanders on the road.
Sure. How about the Virgin Islands and Houston?
In the VI, our system was built so that we're redundant. When I'm down, all my calls will route to St. Croix and vice versa. Like Fearon said, our telephone system, which routes all of our wireless calls, was severely hit. And so the redundancy that we thought we had, we did not. So what happened, and our calls don't queue. Our end result, if someone can't get 911, is a recording. And so a lot of people were getting that, which we know now causes great panic in a time like that. And so that's what happened. We were unable to do any callbacks because, of course, VIA was down, and that's where we get our information in our Annie and Allie And so we weren't able to see numbers calling. We weren't able to see location. So we were just praying that whoever just called, that they call back. And so that definitely is something that we need to address.
How about text to 911? Stan, I know in Greater Harris County, you guys have text to 911 capability, which for those of you who may not be as familiar with the 911 issues that we all deal with, that's not universally true in the United States. Some areas have the ability to receive text to 911 messages and others don't. I think we're seeing a slow uptick where eventually I think everyone will get there. But at the current time, that's not necessarily the case. So, one, could people text to 911? Did they? Was there, more texting to 911 than normal? And also, one of the things I learned recently that's interesting about text to 911 is the ability to text back to the customer, to the caller. So, a lot of folks in the 911 community, when the idea of texting to 911 first emerged, it was kind of a frightening concept, right? Because there was this fear of, tens of thousands of text messages coming in. But I don't think that's actually been borne out, really. But one of the advantages has been you get a lot of calls that come in. There's hang-ups, for example. You can text out instead of having to call them back like they were talking about. So I'm curious if any of that was used. Just overall, what was the experience with text to 911?
Okay. Yeah, and first, just again, on our call volume, we saw a 10 times increase. So as these folks are here saying, it's impossible to handle that many calls. So obviously calls were in queue. I will say the public, they panic, as said up here. They're used to 911 being answered immediately. So, we had numbers in the database that called 10, 15 times. They'd hold for 15 seconds, hang up, call back, hang up. And then we got to process every one of those calls. So, we constantly were on social media saying, do not hang up, stay on the line. We had our recorded announcements on there. I know people don't like recorded announcements, but there could be worse situations. So that did help that as well. And as far as text, yes, we implemented text to 911 in 2013. The fear was that, oh my gosh, we're going to be inundated. The reality, our reality for that is it's still less than 1%. It's a fraction of a percent of our entire call volume. Everyone here, I think, realizes, at least up here, realize that a text session takes way longer to process than a voice session. So that's why we were all afraid. But I'm trying to put folks at ease. We're even seeing the younger folks that like to text. When they want 911, we see they want to reach out and reach us with voice. So, and we have used text. Some of the sites have even changed their policy. They don't do voice callbacks. They do text callbacks. It's, for some reason, they see that as a little more efficient. So it's been useful.
Good. Yeah.
So currently, we do not, Miami-Dade County does not do text 911. However, we're in the process of installing this month, beginning installation of a NG 911 system for our primary PSAP, and the tertiary PSAPs within the county will be following suit. The ESI net has been installed, and we're waiting to go live on that. So by the beginning of the next hurricane season this year in 2018, somewhere in that time frame, we will be on a NG 911 system, and shortly thereafter, we'll be able to take text.
Great.
Prior to the storm, so early 2017, because we are long overdue for upgrades to our system. We're still using the same system when we opened in 2009. That includes CAD and phones. We did demos early in 2017. We were hoping to get the system upgraded by now. However, due to the storms, that's obviously thrown off. We did demo some projects that had text to 911, and we're hoping we could get that up and running. It'll be a great help, especially, domestic violence situation. And then, of course, we're in the islands, so we experience hurricanes all the time, minor to major storms.
Yeah. So on the social media point, you guys have both all of you have sort of hit on social media. So I imagine you used it to notify citizens, right, to try to just provide information about, what was going on. I have a couple examples here that I pulled off the internet. where it was interesting. So here we have the Houston Police Department specifically saying, don't use social media for rescue requests. Call 911. On the other hand, it sounds like at one point for you guys, that was the only way you were going to hear about anything. Because the system was down. So I
Correct.
imagine it's sort of different depending on your situation, right? You sort of have to adapt to what it is that you're experiencing. And just as a couple examples, I have 2 children with me. Water is swallowing us up. Please send help. 911 is not responding. And I'm sure that's not because you didn't want to respond, but it was just being overwhelmed at that time, right? Need a rescue. Girl on ventilator. No power. In flooded home with the address. And then here's another image of somebody asking for help. So just interested in your perspective on the value of social media in these emergencies, what it's particularly effective at, and perhaps also what it's not effective at, and what some of the concerns you might have, if any.
So in Miami-Dade County, social media was very effective on getting information out to the community as to what shelters were open, what shelters were pet-friendly, as an example, and where people could evacuate to, where resources were available post-storm, what road closures were happening and stuff like that. We used a unified approach from the Emergency Operations Center, so the messages from the mayor's office and the emergency operations centers were pushed out right from the EOC and from police and fire collectively, so one message was put out. We didn't see any, that I shouldn't say any, but not that I recall, occurrences of people requesting assistance like you've just shown on our side.
Okay.
For us, our main agency is the Emergency Management Agency. So the EOC puts out all the information for the community, likewise. Shelters, closures, different things like that, and, where they need to go for assistance. They'll also put out in case, just like in the situation, I'm sorry, where my center went down, the alternate wasn't alternate PSAP, but my calls were routed to the EOC. So they would put out their EOC number through social media so people know to call. The community knows to call the EOC for assistance. On our end, it would be, we did get a lot of information coming in about, requests for assistance, housing communities and different things like that. Unfortunately, 911 Center does not have their own social media site that we monitor, but so we were going on the assistance of screenshots coming to us from rescue, from anybody who's on social media that might have a friend that posted that they needed assistance. They screenshot it and send it to one of our work phones, and that's how we were inputting that type of information.
Yeah, so
That's okay. I was gonna add to that. For us, in the St. Thomas Center, social media came in rather handy. We didn't think about it before,
Right.
but as soon as our center became overwhelmed, you start hearing all these little dings, and it's like, guys, you can't have your phone, and they're like, no, my mom needs help, or somebody just texts me that I know. So for us, it came in extremely handy. And I said before, with the rescue units in strategic locations, we were able to communicate with them also through the social media, the texting, the Facebook, the Instagrams. And it was surprising after everything was done that we kind of tell people, keep off of social media, when it comes to emergency management, because, we have our things in perspective and we want things to be said right. It's amazing how it helped greatly during that time. So I think it's something that we probably need to look in, probably on a more organized scale. And like Nadia mentioned, it wouldn't hurt for the 911, the PSAPs, to actually have that outlet, if need be, in the emergency, that we could actually push information through. Although we had the EOC assisting with all our phone lines in the actual building down, someone had to physically get up, walk to the EOC, listen, we need to get this out. It took some time. So, if that's something that we could work on, that would be awesome.
So yeah, the same for us. Social media was a good outlet to get in touch with everyone as the storm came through. I will say the HPD may have not wanted them to use social media because the system was up, but City of Houston and other agencies were monitoring social media, and they did communicate with citizens that way. So we just didn't want then for every citizen to think that's the way to get through. So I'll tell you that again, folks get desperate, and they even got our 24/7 network operations center. Folks were calling that. I don't know how they got the number. So, people are going to do whatever they can to get through, and we have to realize that and adapt.
And do you think that, some of the national public safety associations, to your point, should look at sort of, there's all kinds of standards for operational and technical standards in the 911 space. I don't know that there's a social media standard, for example, but.
Yes, definitely. After going through 2 storms, social media is actually what kept us up and running. When VIA went down, we had people texting with information. Like we all said, Facebooking who they know. Yeah. I know you work there. This is what's needed. At one point, WhatsApp was like the communication. It's like, okay, we're going to form a group. We're going to put all the rescue heads, the chiefs. This is what we're going to put. We're going to push it out that way. So definitely.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, by all means, please, question. There you go.
I have a question for the Houston one. When it comes to social media, I saw in an article that there were private citizens triaging calls and like calling out the Cajun Navy and everything. How did you mingle with that or control that?
So again, I know a lot of the call centers were utilizing that, and that's a good point. A shout out to the Cajun Navy. I will let you know there were a lot of Texans out there too with boats. But what we've got to do is those volunteers, and we're really looking at how we can leverage those volunteers, because first responders, we only have so many. And obviously there's all kinds of issues with volunteers, but we're looking at that in our environment as well. But social media could play a huge role in the volunteer effort. If we could somehow harness it and make it a little more organized so that we could provide those services. So we're looking at that.
So you mentioned the people, and obviously 911 it's a technical issue, right? But none of it works without people there to answer the calls. And you all talked about this a little bit, but maybe a little more in terms of how it impacted physically, psychologically, any of the 911 call takers and responders, and also whether or not the Telecommunicator Emergency Response Task Force, they call it the TERT program, was used. Did you have folks from other areas coming in, and was that helpful?
I'll start a little bit on that. So I've been in communications for nearly a decade. When I first walked in the door, I was getting my introduction to the dispatch center and that type of stuff, and they showed me the quiet room. Well, I thought that's where the people went when they were bad or something like that. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so the quiet room is a real place in telecommunication centers and dispatch centers, and it's a place that doesn't have a TV. It's low lighting, and it's designed so that the 911 call takers and that the dispatchers, when they come off the console, can have and there's no phones, and they can have a place to sit that is peaceful, and they can unwind for a few minutes, because it's very stressful in a regular situation on day-to-day operations. The storms, what they bring is an exponential level of stress for our folks. And I know Ron and I are both very proud, and I'm sure you folks all too, the way that our folks all handled the stressors that went along with the storms. You've got to keep in mind that you've got folks with that are single parents, and as much as you like to say you're supposed to have a plan, when these things happen, sometimes your plan A is your only plan, and there is no plan B that you can really execute. So dispatch centers become family centers unofficially for a temporary period of time, and it's just something we have to do, or else we just don't have the staff there. You brought up TERT. I think you asked about. So there's a program that allows. It's an organized program for telecommunicators to be called upon in areas of the country and volunteer after receiving a certain amount of training to go to other dispatch centers. We received the call to help, but we unfortunately could not lend anyone at the time. Keep in mind what happens in a dispatch center. So every dispatch center works a little bit differently, 8-hour shifts normally, or 12-hour, 10-hour, or 12-hour shifts, depending on your dispatch center, or your PSAP, your 911 center. We go to what we call an Alpha Bravo. So that means that you're on 12 hours, off 12 hours, at least how we operate, on 12 hours, off 12 hours. Well, most times you can't leave. You're going somewhere to take a cat nap, so to speak, and then come back. So we couldn't, we had double the staff on the floor, all of our staff, every single person that was available was working. The PSAP, Ronald talked a second ago, doubled all open consoles in positions. So the people were very affected, and it's a human thing, and you have to keep that in mind and make, work with people and make every reasonable accommodation that you absolutely can.
So imagine you're a single parent. You've got 3 kids. None of them are teenagers. One's 2, one's 4, and the other one's 7. And you're the person who's going to get stuck in the center. The door's locked, and you're not leaving.
When you said the door is locked, there's
No, they're locked. Shutters are closed.
shutters.
You're not going out, and no one's coming in. So, because if you do, your door's going to get ripped off. So, and then your center's gone. So, imagine that. What do you do with your kids? Well, like Greg said, we have to think about that, and we have to do, makeshift childcare, right, and sleeping areas for them. And you got to think about the food for them, and what are they going to need? So, those responsibilities for the food and bringing a sleeping bag and all that rely on the parent, obviously. But then you have to have staff that watches them. They can't be unsupervised. So there's a big strain on resources. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't do those human things for our staff, they are not going to come to work. And that's a fact. One of the big things that affects 911, even on a daily basis, is retention. Okay? Everybody's going, because it's true.
Well, actually, can you talk about that just in general for
Yeah.
folks who are less familiar with sort of the retention issues that we have?
So, Miami-Dade County, both police and fire, our dispatchers and our call takers go way beyond the training that's required by the state. A state of Florida requires a state certification to be a call taker or a dispatcher.
Which is not universally true for what it's worth, right?
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. So, what would you say, Greg? Eight times as long?
Yes.
Yeah, about that. So, imagine being in training for well over a year and a half. Okay, over 18 months from the time you walked in the door. And then there's a selection process that takes about 2 years just to get selected. So you've invested from the time a person signed up till they're able to be a call taker or dispatcher on the floor, 3.5 years, okay, to get that person in the seat. And the average retention, I can tell you, is between 3 and 4 years. If you can get 3 or 4 good years out of people, everybody goes, that's good, right? So imagine that, okay? If we were the public sector, would that be an approved stat for the public sector in any Fortune 500 company? No, okay? So, I'm sorry, for the private sector. So, that's the real challenge. And I'll tell you what the challenge is that funding. It's exactly what it is. We have to hire enough people, okay, to cover for, we have predominantly female workforce across the country, okay, that are in telecommunications, predominantly female workforce, okay? And we need to, across the board, okay, as managers, look at their needs. And you need to have people to replace them, okay? You can't tell them, hey, we're at minimum staffing and you can't take you're not allowed to take off from work to go take your kid to the doctor, okay? But if you let them go, then the public suffers. So that's the problem, and that's the dual-edged sword, okay? They have to sit in the seats. If we don't have call takers and dispatchers sitting in those seats, okay, on an everyday basis and in time of crisis, one 911 call does not get answered, none of them do, and none of those calls then get dispatched to the first responders.
I'm just going to chime in before you ladies take it. So imagine going to work and then being told you can't come home. You can't go home. That's called mandating. And we unfortunately have to do it sometimes, and it's a terrible, from my perspective, management, it's terrible to be forced to be in that position. So retention rate, we have a 48% retention from beginning to becoming a full-time dispatcher. Unlike you, people don't leave us. But once they're there, they stay for a long time. But no, seriously. So we have a 2-to-1. So for every 2 people I hire, only 1 will successfully make it through the training program. And that's a lot of time and money and investment into that. So it's a challenge.
Only 2 out of 10 will. Only 2 out of 10 will make it for us after about a 2 or 3 year mark. We've got 2 people left.
Wow.
But, yeah.
Whew, yes. So before the storm, I normally prepare my staff. We switch them to 16-hour shifts. Yeah. And that's a mandate. So with what we saw when we looked at Irma, we knew it wasn't going to be good. So what I allowed my staff to do at that time was, let's make a plan, because once you're in, you're going to probably be in for about 7 days. And like everybody else, if your staff isn't mentally there, it's going to work against you. So what I allowed them to do was, those single moms, you know, if you want to bring your kids, go ahead. I have one employee who lives with her elderly mom. You want to bring her here? Good. Where we were going to put them, I didn't think about that. But I just knew that I would have employees working for the community with their head on correctly, because their worries and concerns were right in front of them. And they knew that they were going to be good. So we allowed them to do that. My center looked like a shelter within a couple hours, because we slept everywhere, under the printer, next to the printer, under the table, in the council, on the council. We were everywhere. Okay, but I knew for the majority of my staff that we were good and we would still be able to handle calls. So that was a comfort, and I think for the future, we need to look into actually having somewhere in the building where all of that can happen. If we have someone who's going to deal with childcare, fine, and what's not. And I also had employees that lost their entire home. So guess where became their home? Council number 1, under the desk, that was their home. And we allowed them to do that until we're able to assist them with housing. As far as the retention, retention is a major issue for us. One, let's start, when we go through our hiring process, each applicant has to go through a critical testing. Our numbers are horrible. If we get 10 people that apply, there's going to be 1 that actually barely passed that. And it's just basically a simulation of your 911 system. You know, we're checking to see if you can multitask, if your hearing is well, you know, if you can hear that he said left, not right. And it's such a shame that we have a lot of people that are not passing that critical testing to enable them to even be interviewed. So that's one of our issues now. Once they get in, the problem that we have with retention is, 1, their pay. After visiting Fairfax yesterday,
Yes.
our pay is not even in the ballpark. And we do everything. In Fairfax, you are hired as a call taker, you start at 40 whatever. In the Virgin Islands, you're hired as a call taker, EMS dispatch, police, fire, rescue, whoever you need to dispatch, that's who you're going to dispatch, and you do all of that in at one 8-hour shift, and we start at 28. Okay, and so that's part of our retention. We also need to work on our critical debriefing. We do not currently have any MOUs in place. When an incident happens, our critical debriefing is having squad leaders take their staff off the floor and have a conversation. Right now, I know we both feel the same way. It's not good enough. After the storm, thank God for FEMA and all the federal help. We were able to have, I think the Navy came in and they gave us excellent critical debriefing. FEMA sent some people to us, which was excellent. And just quickly, you mentioned TERT. We speak frequently with our friend in South Carolina 911 Center, and he sent us the whole plan. Let's do this. Y'all sound, it's horrible. You know, we're ready. We forwarded up the chain, but of course it's not familiar. It's never happened, and so they had to think about it. Let's just say they're still thinking about it.
We're thinking about it.
For listening to Carolyn speak about the situations, it's a little different for me because Carolyn is actually, her center is actually in the same building as our emergency operations center. So they have a little bit more room there. However, I am away from Vitima, so my center is smaller probably than this room, my whole center. And that includes my floor with the 12 stations, a very small break room, and my server room, all in that one building. So to add, I mean, I would love to be like, okay, bring your kids. After the storm, I allowed them to bring their kids in if they needed. However, during the storm, I didn't allow them to do it at that time. I mean, thinking back now, I probably, should or would think about it for the future, but it would have to be something I planned far in advance so I could, take up the space, food, different things like that. Or maybe I need to come up with another plan, maybe off-site, that we could call this, okay, emergency personnel family care. Something separate to the shelters that our agency run.
Sure.
Debriefing, yeah, that's something that we definitely need to get into. We've been utilizing through our health care from the Virgin Islands government. We've been utilizing those services for employees. And then just me and Carolyn just using ourselves, our resources, our connects to go out and look for employees that we might not have heard from. They happen to be off, and we still can't make contact with them. So we're going out with rescue, with whoever we can make contact with, whatever trucks we could get, and try to get through to their homes to make sure that they're good. Not because we need them to come to work, because of course we do, but it's unsettling for us to know that we have employees with kids out there that might be hurt and can't call 911.
So let me ask one final question. This has been a really interesting discussion. Bottom line, overall, did the system, I mean, we can't plan for every single possible disaster and every different flavor that they're going to come, right? There's always going to be some challenges that we just can't plan for. But overall, did the system meet your expectation? There's a lot of folks in the room who are from companies that, serve 911 centers or provide networks. What was the biggest challenge? Was it, the network, handling call volumes, generators, not having generators or backup power? I imagine it's probably all the above. And how can we do better, I guess? What's the biggest lessons learned here? And, you've talked about next generation 911, some of you, which for those less familiar, in a high-level nutshell, is essentially a modern, all IP-based system that's fundamentally a replacement for the legacy kind of circuit switch TDM telephone network-based systems of the past. how big of a help for these types of emergencies can Next Generation 911 be?
I'll just start off on that one. I would say that the same problems that exist on a day-to-day were very amplified during an emergency like this. Everyone's talked about not having electricity. Everyone's talked about the redundancy or reliability of communication networks. Taking and putting that aside, the problems that we have on a day-to-day basis are magnified. The problem that we have every day is finding the caller to 911. That's our biggest challenge. And NextGen 911 is more than text messages and videos and pictures and stuff like that. What we need to focus on is what Ron and I say, it would be as easy as XYZ. Finding the person's location is critical. Without it, it doesn't matter. The rest of it really doesn't matter if we can't find and know where the 911 call taker is. Excuse me, not 911 caller is. So that's the system, or that's what needs to be, we need to focus on. Like Stan said, and I didn't even know your number, they've had text capability since 2013, you said, and it's less than 1%. Yes. So there's your advanced technology. Now, it definitely has its places. There are definitely situations, domestic situations, and folks hearing impaired, et cetera. That's absolutely, I'm not discounting that. But for the 99+% of the calls, we need, and even those, you need to find the location, and it's X, Y, and Z means elevation. We have a lot of high rises. Someone just calling 911, okay, so we know that you're in that building with 30 floors, and how many apartments or condos on each floor, et cetera. So those are the challenges. So it's location.
I want to dovetail off of that. So if you only get phase one, where are you supposed to send your units? If you only get the tower location, you're sending them to a tower. Phase one first came out, that's where we're going. We're getting dispatched to towers. We're like, why are we getting dispatched here? It was a cell call. No, the people on the road, the cops and the firefighters, they didn't know why. You're just going there, and it becomes a useless task. There's a lot of 911 hang-up calls. You've stated, we all stated, look, you're in a storm, it's a hang-up, you get disconnected, they're at capacity, okay? But if it hits our switch, okay, and even if it hits our switch, if we can pick it up and we can get their GPS location, that is huge. That is huge, because you know where they were. And you know where to send help. If they never answer that call back or you can't get a hold of them, you know where to send a first responder. And that's the problem right now. Okay, there's a lot of steps that have to take place and everything to work perfectly in order to get that location to send a first responder. And it gives us better situational awareness, and you can automatically see right away with NG 911 platforms that are integrated to CAD systems. You start building data very quickly. You can see a picture very quickly. You can respond to incidents much quicker. And that's where we need to go, and we need to get there sooner than later.
And is there greater redundancy? Stan, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so as I said, we're already benefiting from that. We do need to take the final step, though. So we do have single points of failure on the provider end where they ingress into our system, and we're targeted to hopefully take care of that this year. I will say in our area, location information, the providers are doing a pretty darn good job. We are working on advanced location technologies in our NG lab with our partners, so we share those same thoughts. It shouldn't be that difficult to grab that handset location off the phone, and it shouldn't cost public safety any money. It shouldn't cost the public any money. It's part of a basic 911 call, so we support that as well.
For us, I know you asked about did the system meet our expectations. I know in St. Thomas, I think 2 days before the storm, our CAD system just left us. It was gone. We don't know what happened, but it was gone. We were not able to bring it back up when the storm hit. So because of the short period of time and the storm coming, we had to go to our test system. In our test system, it had very little information. We didn't have officers listed. We didn't have units. And so it was very, very difficult. We couldn't assign an officer because he wasn't even in the system. And so it was very difficult at that time. As far as location, I pray that happens sooner than later. One of our biggest challenges is our unique geographics. Where we can come to Washington and drive on 2nd and Independence, you can't do that in St. Thomas. In St. Thomas, we're telling you landmarks. You're gonna see that big tree, it has yellow on the top. You're gonna make a left right there, and then you're gonna see a blue car. It's always parked there. You're gonna make that right. And so we don't have street names. You know, we've named streets because I live on that street, you know, the Rosario's been there forever. It's the Rosario Street, okay? And how we assign plots eons ago, if I bought plot number 1 in 1920, okay, you're plot number 1. But somebody wants plot number 4. Okay, so you're going to be plot number 2, though, because you came second. Of course, that makes all the sense. And so you have streets, you'll say, I live at 8468. The plot right next to you is 8490. So it's very difficult, and I know our Lieutenant Governor's office has been working for, I would say, almost 2 years now to try to figure out a way that they can actually get some kind of location information. We're still in phase 1, so we have X and Y coordinates. Nobody in the islands goes based on X, Y coordinates other than the Coast Guard. So X and Y coordinates means nothing to our first responders. And the street signs that we have, they're labeled as route this, route that. What does that mean to us? Only our visitors are like, yeah, I'm at Route 44. And we're like, do you see a big tree? Do you see the blue car? You know, so we have a big hole there that we need to figure out. They were talking about just renaming the whole island. I don't know how that's gonna work. So it's a big project. Again, the Lieutenant Governor's office has taken that on. And I don't project unless we get some genius in there. I don't see it happening within the next 5 to 7 years. So location is a huge thing for us.
Sure. Howard, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. So this started out with the chairman kind of talking about a couple of things. You need to push on NG 911, and then also right. And do you feel like, I mean, that was more, that was stuff that was a little more kind of high, you know, that's pretty high up, you know, that's a 30,000 feet type recommendations. Do you feel, just from your interactions with the federal government, that there's more that the FCC or the federal government could do? You know, particularly in the Virgin Islands, because I think that, well, the FCC was pretty quick to go down to, it was much slower to get to the, to get out to see you guys after the recent disaster.
I think in the Virgin Islands, we need to educate not just our government and our first responders on exactly what FCC does, what it offers, what it's in charge of, et cetera, et cetera. And the resources that are available through the FCC. And I think that's a big problem. Like I told someone yesterday, we don't have the opportunity to drive to another state to see another center. We don't have the opportunity to travel to, you know, some of these conferences and meetings as we would like. And so a lot of our information that we would gain with those opportunities, we don't get. I know some of the tickets right now coming out of St. Thomas St. Croix is $1,600 to go to Miami. Really, it's a 2.5 hour plane ride. So yes, we need a lot more information from our partners to be sent to us, our government, and it needs to trickle down. It doesn't need to stay at the top, which I think a lot of that is happening. A lot of the information that on Nadia and I level that would be beneficial to us and that we will be able to actually start a working plan is being stuck at the top. And so we need those opportunities. We need to see and hear more on our level, more so on the top level. So yes.
Curious also from your perspective, whether, whether it's Congress and funding or whether it's the FCC or somebody else, if there's things that folks in Washington can do to help you at the state and local level.
I'll start. I guess at the end of the day, I'm just going to try and drive home the theme of location. Whether it's a regulatory effort, whether it's everyone get in the same room, you lock the door until they figure it out, I have no idea. But at the end of the day, the methods that are being deployed right now or are being considered proprietary, challenging technologies to go across different systems are not where we need to be. We need to be with an open source technology that all the carriers can implement and have to implement where, pardon? So look, at the end of the day, it's all about location for 911. It's all about location, and whatever needs to be done to have the wireless carriers provide us with the information as close as humanly possible where a caller is what needs to take place. Whether the FCC is the cheerleader and brings it through, I'm not in that position to give you that. But I can tell you that everyone sitting here would say it's all about the location, because if we can't find the 911 caller, it doesn't matter.
Number one, location. I'm going to say it again, location. But also, funding is extremely important. You've got to have redundancy. And redundancy isn't just, hey, you've got one building and I'm going to put a server closet over here and a server closet over here. No, they have to be geographically different. And then you have power supplies for them, okay? And networking, and be on a fiber ring, and the fiber coming in, okay? To different pathways, because you know what? Someone could be out digging a hole for a fence post, and you cut your fiber and your center's down, okay? Or the same thing for the power. So you have to have different pathways for all this. So it really has to be thought about, and all of these 911 centers need to be self-contained, okay? Like we've all talked about. In a crisis, okay, they need to be self-contained, and there needs to be really some thought about this. And it costs money. It costs a lot of money to do these things we need to do. But at the end of the day, it's pennies on the dollar for somebody's life, okay? We're not talking about going to play a video game on the internet. We're not talking about, oh, I want to do my shopping list on the internet. We're talking about leveraging, okay, the current technology to save people's lives. That's what we do. And if we have the location, the shorter amount of time, as soon as that call hits our center, we have the exact location instantly from their device, okay? That can mean the difference between someone's life or death. That can mean the difference from somebody getting a first responder to break the window out of their car when it's sinking in a canal, or them drowning in the back seat trying to knock the rear window out, okay? And we've had multiple cases across the country of those similar type of things happening. So, from a first responder perspective, that's what we need. We need the funding, we need the location, and we need the federal government to drive home the standards and set it and put timelines on when everything needs to get done.
All right, Stan, last word.
So yeah, all the states are going to struggle with funding. We're a little spoiled in this industry. We've been leveraging equipment that was installed in the 80s, and we've been paying for it, and it still works well. So I will tell you, the NextGen environment, it's expensive. But I agree with a competitive, standards-based market. We're already seeing prices come down on some of the offerings in Texas. And a lot of us are resource sharing, which is good. Work with your partners in a region. And that's really what NextGen is all about, I think, putting those pieces together. And we really want local survivability. I know having things in the cloud is good, and that may work for some small centers, but we have to be able to survive, at least as an island, and then interoperate with other ESI nets. So that's our theory at Greater Harris County, and I think a lot of the folks in Texas share that same thought.
Great. Any last questions? Yeah.
Thanks for all your presentation. My name is Li Yang. We are talking about communication, whether it is phone line or social media. I just wonder, do you have statistics how many people in your residence who has no communication equipment, no computer, or no social media, no landline, no iPhone, whatever phone is this? Do you have that type of information? And then second is that is there any record about some kind of obstruction or misconduct by whether it's official or somebody else or third party? They obstruct people's communication or their work computer or iPhone, or they disable their phone, so there's no way to communicate. And I think in this situation or disaster, I think they will cause a lot of deaths, and you don't even know how to locate where is the problem. And if you don't know that the situation, they have been obstructed, that they have no method of communication, how do you locate the real problem?
I know in the Virgin Islands, we don't have the exact statistics, but we do know that a majority of elderly individuals are the ones that do not have the communication. They're not gonna go on, a lot of them don't believe in cell phones, so they have landlines. Landlines went out. A lot of them are not using the computers, so they wouldn't get information via Facebook. A lot of them don't have wireless phones, and if they do, it's a flip phone. And so we know in the VI that our issue is getting information to the elderly. And I know our Human Services Department is actually working on something to assist them in that area.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure in the Houston market, there's a pretty good saturation. I would say that most all folks have a way to communicate. I know there's all different kind of avenues there, so I don't think there's a problem in that area for us.
So let's wrap up. You all have been very patient with and generous with your time. I do want to just make folks aware of the fact that February 16th this year, so just about a month from now, is the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call that was ever made. And we will be celebrating that anniversary along with providing some awards to different categories of individuals at an event here in the Rayburn Foyer on February 14th at 5 o'clock. And then in this actual room, we will have a demonstration from about 8 or 10 companies will be demonstrating different technology, including location technology solutions, and different next generation 911 capabilities on February 15th, starting at 10 o'clock. And of course, you're all invited to that. As always, thank you again to our sponsors. And our contact information for the NG 911 Institute and myself is available here. And I would like to just thank each of the panelists for not only coming here today, but what you do every day, and all the people that you work with in your centers. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today.